You mentioned that you were in a water meeting downstairs with the groups from both sides of the state for the mitigation deal. Can you talk to me about the progress of that so far? It's been a couple weeks since the executive order came out that you signed. Where is progress at towards creating a new mitigation deal?
Well, their date in my executive orders for this group is October 1st. So as often the case when people are negotiating, the further away from the hard date, the further they are, and the closer they get together. And they're, does the model work? How do we prove the model? Because if it was just surface water, all we had to do is go out and put a ruler in the creek and measure the water, that'd be easy. But it's the water below in the Lake Erie-sized aquifer that's the lifeblood of the state. It's the lifeblood of the state in one part of the state because they pump out of it. It's the lifeblood in most of the rest of the state because the water that comes out of it is what other farmers, and for better or worse, they were the first farmers here. Before well technology existed, people were surface water. But what's interesting is people don't realize how many surface water and older water rights there are in what's seen as the eastern part of the state. That half of those people have surface water rights, older rights. So it's really not a geographic issue. It's really not the Magic Valley versus East Idaho. It's really senior water rights versus junior water rights. But because pumps technology is newer technology, that's the newer farmland.
Right. All right. Let me run through a couple of these questions real quick. We're talking about the aquifer today, the water that people can't see. Last time we were able to speak at the actual executive order signing and revealing, and I was able to speak to one of your press secretaries, Madison, earlier. It seemed like things were moving in a positive direction. Is that true?
Oh, they absolutely. I mean, it's hard, but the people downstairs and the people that are negotiating on this fully realize that, some of the groundwater people know that the level from which the amount of electricity you have to spend to get the water up is going up. Not in every area, but then how do you average it? And that's one of the issues that when I was making all the phone calls and talking to everybody, they said, well, if we do a great job one year and the next year there's a little less water, do we get credit for the previous year? That's what we call averaging. And then in a year where it's really bad, do we have a pool of water that's available to make people whole to get over that period of time? The problem is, on average, we're having less snow in the mountains. On average, we're having the rainfall at the time of year we don't need it when it all goes out. We're trying to capture that water and put it into recharge, managed recharge. And we've done a lot of it, and we've done some really good work. We're gonna have to do more, but we've done the easy stuff. Now, we gotta get the fruit off of the tree, we gotta climb taller, higher in the tree, and it's gonna cost us more money, and we don't have the certainty. But those are all things that those good people are discussing downstairs right now.
All right. Let's talk about recharge and about the actual levels of the aquifer when it comes to the methodology by the Idaho Department of Water Resources. One of the critiques of the deals in the past is that they've made these deals in the past, but the methodology has had to change, not because of the Idaho farmers on the eastern side of the state or the western side of the state, or even the Idaho Department of Water Resources, but one of the comments is that by the Idaho Department of Water Resources, that they're being held to a methodology by the courts because of the way that the mitigation agreement has been worked out and signed.
That's correct.
Is there being any work done with this new mitigation agreement to relook at that methodology?
Absolutely.
All right.
Absolutely. And if there was a plexiglass view of the aquifer and you could see it, but we have sentinel wells, which we put all around the state, but the sentinel wells measure what we think is the level in the aquifer. It's not 100% accurate. But then we have the water that comes back into the river that our oldest water rights in Idaho and all over are dependent upon. But we can get there. But we knew when I first started as a legislator, we had conversations about conjunctive management. In other words, that if you take water out of the ground, does it affect the river water? And nobody denies it. It's just how do you define it?
Next question. Obviously, water rights are a difficult issue and a complicated issue. One of the concerns that people on this side of the state have expressed to us is that they've made deals, mitigation deals in the past that were supposed to improve these things and keep these curtailments from happening. While the 2015 deal ultimately led to this with that methodology, the concern on this side of the state is that even with the work that's being done downstairs by members of both sides of the state, that this mitigation deal will end up the same. What is your response to that concern?
We're having a discussion about here's what we know and here's what we're going to do. If it changes, when do we adjust it? My position, which is very hard, is we need to do it this time of year for next year so that there's certainty. That I'm very willing to what the agreement is, to do all I can to fund it, to make sure it's enforced, to everything, but I don't want to have it be like we did this year, where it's in April, May, and June, because of how disruptive that is. It's just not fair. And now there's going to have to be adjustments, but I want that certainty as soon as possible, and I'm certain everybody agrees with me. I've done this for quite a while. I was in the legislature, I served on the Resources Committee, and that's why I suggested at the Water Summit that I had last fall, when I talked to everyone, is I am fine with the legislature looking at it, but it's too late. That's why I've suggested the interim committee. There's an interim committee of the Senate and the House on natural resources, and I've urged them, but that's a legislative decision. That's not the governor's decision. But I've urged them to get together to explore these. A lot of them have been explored before, and for one reason or another, but you can't have a legislative position that only a few of your neighbors and friends agree with, because then the whole state has to come together if they're going to change the law.
All right. Let's talk with that about the whole state and about representatives from both sides of the state. During the actual setup for these meetings downstairs, and mind me real quick, I'm just adjusting my shot to go on to get a little bit of variety. During the discussion about the executive order from last month and the months leading up to it, you mentioned that you're going to have farmers from both sides of the state be able to talk about this agreement. Why is that a benefit to these discussions, and how does that play a role in what's going on downstairs?
Well, what I ended my water summit, I've ended every, and I mentioned downstairs that in the states where the people that use the water haven't come to an agreement, either a state court or worse, a federal court or even Congress, and in the case of Texas, New Mexico, and I think Colorado, the U.S. Supreme Court weighed in on it. And I used to say farmers that wore coveralls. Not very many farmers wear coveralls anymore. But farmers need to decide this rather than have, because we need to be masters of our own destiny. There's a lot of congressional representation downstream from the Snake River. And if they get engaged and it's a popularity contest, we only have 2 members out of 435 members of Congress will be at a disadvantage. But what's not been talked a lot about is half of the irrigated acres in eastern Idaho are senior surface water. So we're only talking about the other half, but of course they're the ones that that basically were told they needed to do something. So they're the ones that are most engaged, as they should be. Anytime your livelihood's engaged or is endangered, then you get engaged. But I want everybody to be engaged so that they realize the magnitude of the problem.
All right. Let's talk about the magnitude of the problem with the actual aquifer itself. The mitigation agreements and works going on downstairs are to help understand and better work together as farmers on each side of the state, but we also have the Idaho Water Advisory Council that's working on a better understanding and measurement of the aquifer, which will impact the work going on downstairs. What work is being done on that end so far in the last couple of weeks to go on to better understand the aquifer that will help us in the future?
Well, I always say that farmers and hydrologists, scientists that study the water are better than lawyers. No disrespect to the legal profession, because ultimately they'll have a big say in this. But that's what's taken place, is that the hydrologists, and because it's hard to measure, because you cannot see it, and the connection of the water that's coming into the river versus what the well levels are, but we're going to get better at that all the time. Technology is going to help an enormous amount. Our ability to real-time measure water, there's going to be a lot of technology that's going to be developed. What we're doing to recharge, where we do recharge, we want to do recharge in places that make a difference, but we need to think about our grandchildren. We need to think about the long-term future of the state of Idaho and the sustainability of our communities that are dependent upon irrigated water. And we've had some areas where regionally they've gotten together and come to the conclusion. The Wood River Valley, which is the Bellevue, Haley, Peekaboo area, they had basically an order where the senior water users, the people that have had the water rights for the longest time, said we're not getting our water. They got together, and now they've got a little different cropping. It's not perfect this year, but they got it done. But it's a much smaller group. They knew the neighbor that was being, they saw the neighbor at the parts store and at church and at school, and they got that resolved. It's not perfect, but that's the kind of solution that I want to work for.
All right. Could you speak to the idea of being neighbors and community when it comes to Idaho? Because a lot of the farmers here in East Idaho, they're worried about themselves, as you said. They're very involved with their own crops, with their own land, with their own livelihoods. Some of them don't understand the farmers on the other side of the state because that's a completely separate group in their minds. Can you speak to the idea of
Well, it's not only the farmers on the other side of the state, it's their neighbor that didn't get a curtailment order that is right down the road because they haven't been as energized. But we're trying to do this for the long-term future of the state, so that a federal judge in the Ninth Circuit, which is what we're in, doesn't say, which is what's happened in some of these other states, you have to let this water go down the river for whatever it might be.
All right. Let me look through my questions real quick just to see. I think you cleared up the confusion on what the October 1st deadline is for, because that's very clearly set out in your executive order. To be quite honest, some people have confusion on what it actually is. Could you just touch on that one more time?
Well, I'm just asking the irrigation community, all the farmers that are dependent upon irrigation, to get together and come up with a long-term solution that's sustainable. It's pretty simple. It may seem a lot more complicated when you talk about reach gains and recharge, but the state has done an enormous, I put $500 million into water projects. There's only one other state that put more ARPA money into water than we did here in Idaho. It is incredibly important to me. It's incredibly important to the state. And we can do this. And even the most aggrieved farmer that I've talked to said, well, if everybody has to sacrifice a little bit, we can get there. That's it, period.
Let's talk, last question that I have, and then we can go over anything that you think I've missed, about that idea of sacrifice. One of the things that people have concerns about is that even with this new agreement, they might not get water. You've mentioned the idea of sacrifice, that maybe there's some changes that will have to be made in farms to go and to make sure that people get the resource that they need but they might have to make some changes in order to get that. Could you speak a little bit?
Oh, they will, but you know, one of the things that farmers do very well is they get more efficient all the time. So when they used to irrigate with a dirt canal, with flood irrigation, with no aluminum sprinkler pipe, that water all went into the river or went into recharge. Farmers, by their very nature, want to be efficient, particularly if they're paying a power bill. So what happens is when they pump a gallon of water out of the ground, it used to be 30% of that went back into the aquifer. Now, in some instances, zero, because they are so sophisticated. They've got weather stations out there. They know what the evaporation rate is. They know everything. They use all of it. We have to account for that. We have to account for the fact. And then, for better or worse, we are very dependent upon crops that consume a lot of water. Alfalfa, potatoes in particular, sugar beets in some instances. And in some instances, grain farmers converted those other crops. We need to take that into account, but our farmers can do that.
All right. Are there any questions that you think that I have missed or anything that you'd like to touch on that we should go further into detail on?
Well, it's, as I told them, they need to be masters of their own destiny. If you're not master of your own destiny, you're not going to like it when somebody else is the master of your destiny. They might have to get along with their neighbors. They might have to do things a little different. But we absolutely need to be masters of our own destiny. I'm an agricultural person for generations here in Idaho. And the last thing I want to do is see anything that's disruptive to not only individual farmers, but our agricultural communities, which is the backbone and the heart of the state of Idaho.